My name is Brad Udall, and I'm the director of the Getches Wilkinson Center here at Colorado Law. I'm also one of the Udall weeds that Dean Weiser talked about earlier today. And in the words of my late and departed brother Randy, how's it go? I am related to people I do not know, to whom you can only guess how that is so, given my heritage. I'm joined today by two experts on climate change, and we have an expert mostly on adaptation, Amelia Peterson, and an expert on mitigation, Roger Pulwarty.
It's the other way.
Oops, flip around. Roger is my longtime friend and mentor and colleague from NOAA. He runs the National Integrated Drought Information System there, and is also the division chief of what's called Climate and Societal Interactions. He's been involved with the IPCC reports, both the AR4 that came out in 2007 and this next report that's partly out, and Working Group 2 will come out shortly. Roger is actually Dr. Pulwarty, although his friends call him Pulwarty, and the moniker is great because he's unique in almost all aspects of life, and it's great to have you here, Roger.
Thank you.
And then Amelia Peterson is here as well. She actually works at the law school and a professor that William Boyd leads. And that's associated with this first talk on the Governor's Climate and Forest Task Force. Amelia has a JD and LLM. She heads what's called the GCF Training Institute and the RED Plus Task Force. And before I turn it over to these two, I'm going to make a few opening comments. So, we've heard this today. Indigenous people are the least contributors of climate change, yet they are the first to suffer from its impacts. And curiously, they actually do more than their fair share on the mitigation front, on the reduction in carbon that we're all being asked to do. The former chairperson of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues said the following, and I don't like to read, but I think this is powerful enough to read. Indigenous peoples mainly are peoples of the land. We live off the land and resources found in our lands and waters. We are the main stewards of biological and cultural diversity. Our rights, our cultures, our livelihoods, traditional knowledge, and identities are based on the profound and intricate relationships we forged with our lands, waters, and resources over thousands of years. Thus, when our lands and resources disappear or are altered due to climate change, we suffer the worst impacts. Because indigenous peoples are tied to the land, and because that land is intricately related to the carbon cycle, none of us here should be surprised that FPIC enters the picture, right? That carbon emissions, carbon sequestration are all tied into what they do and how we should interact with them. And to indigenous peoples, I should say, forests are not just carbon stocks, right? They're far more than that. At the risk of insulting your knowledge here, I want to make a distinction between what the IPCC calls mitigation, that is to say reduction in greenhouse gases, and adaptation, which is dealing with these impacts that we're not going to mitigate against. And there's an FPIC connection to both of these. In 1997, when the Conference of the Parties met in Kyoto, we came up with the Kyoto Protocol, right? And developing countries were supposed to reduce their emissions. Remember that concept? So out of Kyoto came the idea that maybe a developed country might not just reduce its emissions inside its own country, but go to a developing country and do a joint project to reduce emissions. And part of that idea was imposed in the idea of what's called the Clean Development Mechanism. And it sounded like a great idea at the time, and it turned out to be not such a great idea. It's not such a great idea because people have gamed the system, and also, I hope, because indigenous peoples have suffered under some of these projects. It might involve, for example, clean hydropower that has involved removing people from their lands. CDM's probably going to go away, but some market-based version of this is going to return, again with impacts for indigenous people. So 10 years later, in Bali in 2007, another concept came out called RED, R-E-D-D, Reducing Forest Degradation and Deforestation. And I think most of you are aware that something like 20% of all carbon emissions on the planet actually come out of land use and land cover change. And hence this idea that one could do good things by managing our forests better seems to have, at the time, seems to have a lot of promise. Yet RED itself has become controversial, again, because forests are not just stocks of carbon to indigenous folks. Let me talk briefly about adaptation. And analogously to the mitigation side, where global actions on mitigation impact indigenous people, you can make the same case on the adaptation front. And when I was trying to come up with an example of this, I actually thought about some of my own research, which involves dust on snow in the American Southwest. If you're not familiar with this, we think that late season dust storms in the Colorado River that deposit this dark cover on the top of our snowpack actually reduce snowpack by 5% and speed up the runoff by 3 weeks. This is peer-reviewed literature, and people are taking it seriously. The kicker here is that this dust is coming out of northeastern Arizona, including the Navajo Reservation. And some people propose that we actually try and do something about this dust, that we actually kind of keep it in place. Yet such action obviously would need the concurrence, the consent of the peoples that are affected by this. And so there's an interesting tie there. And I'll note one other little example that's kind of fun on the, or not fun, it's indicative of not so much forests, but the Arctic, which is the fastest part of the planet that's warming right now. So just this week in the Wall Street Journal and in several other newspapers, there's an article about Greenland approving mining. And Greenland has these huge ice sheets on it, right? 10,000 feet of ice in the middle that if it melts is 6 meters of sea level rise. But it also has 57,000 people that live on it, 57,000 mostly Inuit people that live on it. And they have decided internally that perhaps their future lies in mining. Uranium, rare earths, iron ore are some of the things that are available in Greenland. And they're doing this because their traditional fishing is on a decline, likely in part due to climate change. So it's interesting, this connection that both mitigation and adaptation have FPIC connections. And with that brief introduction, I'm going to let Amelia go first, and I promise you we're done at 5.
Hi, everyone. So I'm going to really zoom through my presentation because the GCF presentation is notorious for being extremely long, and I'm conscious of our time. So I've really shortened it just to try and get us out of here really quickly. So Brad, thank you for your opening remarks and for your introduction. And I think it's pretty clear from what we already know and from what Brad mentioned that climate change mitigation and indigenous people and indigenous rights have a pretty clear nexus and connection. Just when you think about the fact that deforestation and forest degradation account for nearly 20% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So that statistic standing alone is more than the entire global transportation sector, and second only to the energy sector. So it's not chump change, it's pretty significant. Let me talk really quickly about the GCF, who we are, what we're doing. The GCF is a collaboration of about 22 states and provinces. So this is a collaboration at the subnational level, not at the national government level. We have a membership of 22 states and provinces and regions across the world in tropical countries. So we are in Brazil, Mexico, you can see it up there, Spain, a couple of US states, a couple of observer states, and a lot of Indonesia. So the GCF was established in 2009, started out with 10 states and provinces. When you look at the statistics, you see how significant the work that the GCF is doing is, and also why it's significant that we be thinking about indigenous peoples and be thinking about FPIC and how we embed FPIC into the GCF process. So over 20% of the world's tropical forests are in these places that we call GCF members. 75% of Brazil, 50% of Indonesia. And the tropical forest states that are part of the GCF are really acting as early movers in building these comprehensive jurisdictional programs. And what we're doing is we're moving from a project by project look at low emissions development. Whether you're thinking strictly about RED or you're talking more broadly about low emissions development, the GCF is moving states and provinces away from the project by project model, which is the model that has really come under criticism for its lax standards when it comes to safeguards, human rights, indigenous rights. And the GCF model pushes all these projects into a jurisdictional model. So it looks at taking, for example, the state of Acre in Brazil that has probably the largest number of RED Plus projects across the world. Another state is Mato Grosso in Brazil that has maybe thousands of RED Plus projects. And the GCF process is bringing the governors of these states and provinces together to agree that they will begin to pass programs and policies that embed all these projects under a particular framework, the GCF framework, that meets particular requirements, that meets international standards, that is agreed upon by GCF states and provinces, so we prevent a race to the bottom, that sort of good stuff. So in a nutshell, that's what the GCF is. This is the GCF map. We actually just got back from Peru for our annual meeting and went very quickly from 19 states and provinces to 22 by the addition of Loreto, San Martin, and Ucayali in Peru. So the GCF is a growing concept, and I'm going to try and explain it as we go along. It tends to be really complicated for people to understand, but I'll do my really best in a few minutes. So I think to just quickly bring it into context and explain it within its context, I want to look for the next maybe 5 minutes at the GCF's work, GCF activities, and how that intersects with indigenous peoples. I'll talk about 3 particular things really quickly. How the GCF is going about this process of developing a jurisdictional framework that embeds within it things like FPIC, things like social and environmental safeguards. Those of you who are familiar with the climate environment at the international level know that there are myriads of standards when it comes to social and environmental safeguards. The GCF jurisdictional framework is in the process of taking from all of those standards and creating a standard that our 22 governors, sometimes regional presidents from these 22 states and provinces across the world can agree to adopt as the standard for their jurisdiction. So that's their state or their province. There's also a process of national alignment. As you know, RED has primarily been spoken about over all these years at a national level, especially in the UNFCCC process. But the GCF really brings down the concept of low emissions development and reducing deforestation. It brings it down to the ground. It's a bottom-up concept that asks the question, where is most of the activity taking place for reducing emissions from deforestation? The activity takes place at the subnational level, not at the national level. And so that's where the focus of the GCF is. I'll also talk really briefly about what we're doing to enhance stakeholder processes, and then something that's super relevant to the GCF work right now and to indigenous peoples is a Constitutional Court decision from the Constitutional Court of Indonesia earlier this year, and I'll address that very, very quickly. So why does it matter? Why does FPIC matter to the GCF? Well, I'll take just as an example Peru, and Peru just joined the GCF over the last 2 years, so they're one of our youngest members. And when I say Peru, I'm not talking about the national government of Peru, but the regional governments of Peru, and there are 5 of them. 4 of them are part of the GCF, so it's significant to us. As you can see from those statistics up there, I won't read it to you, but clearly Peru is a country of indigenous people. So how does the GCF look at FPIC? What is FPIC to the GCF? Well, to the GCF, FPIC is about acquiring free, prior, informed consent from affected local and indigenous communities. And the resource or the source of that concept for us is the Cancun agreements. So again, going back to the international level and downloading the messages or the international principles or norms that are emerging on the international level for FPIC and other areas of indigenous rights, and how that affects any kind of work in climate change. Our specific focus, of course, being mitigation. So Safeguard 2C and 2D under the Cancun Agreement really sort of laid all out for us. So as far as the jurisdictional framework goes, building a jurisdictional framework for the 22 states and provinces that are in the GCF is one of the key objectives of 2014 for the GCF. Its components are varied. I mean, they go all the way from financial mechanisms for low emissions development in GCF states, funding strategies, but what's most relevant to us today is the stakeholder engagement and FPIC in terms of how do we build a jurisdictional framework that captures the principles that the GCF would like to see GCF states and provinces embed within their jurisdictional programs. We're ongoing, on an ongoing basis, we're studying existing standards, as I mentioned before. We also rely a lot on the best practices that are emerging from early mover states within the GCF. Acre, Brazil is one really good example that tends to come up a lot, as well as Chiapas in Mexico that sort of had a bad start in how they were going about getting free and prior-informed consent from communities, but have really done a lot to shape up their programs. And what they've done, the lessons learned from Chiapas are beginning to inform the rest of the GCF family on how to do FPIC process, the practical application of FPIC when it comes to reducing deforestation. And our hope is that by the end of 2014, there will be an adoption of this broad GCF jurisdictional framework, which will include an FPIC process as well. Stakeholder involvement and transparency are probably I can call it a hallmark of the GCF. We're committed to robust stakeholder involvement and full transparency. Some of the organizations that we work with very, very closely as GCF stakeholders are Forest Peoples Program. I think that's the one that jumps out at me right away. Transparency International, Rights and Resources Institute. So in every geographic hub or central hub that we have within the GCF is always one of the primary organizations within that region that ensures that indigenous protections or indigenous rights are embedded into these programs. And so we're working with these groups on an ongoing basis. The other sources, I would say, of this jurisdictional framework that we're building, that we're hoping to be able to roll out by the end of the year for our 22 states and provinces, are some of the key documents that are popping up. As you know, FPIC is a very popcorn-like field or concept. Everybody has something to say about it, and we're all trying to gather it all together and find one common platform in which to describe it or operate in it. Definitely the most recent UN Special Rapporteur on Rights of Indigenous Peoples document on the intersection between extractive industries and indigenous people is very important to us. As you know, Peru is one of the biggest issues in Peru with deforestation is illegal mining. And the 4 regional governments of Peru that are part of the GCF are, this is what they're up against, is the extractive sector. And how do they work with the underground piece of the extractive sector, which is actually the primary piece of the extractive sector in Peru? How do they work with that environment and still meet these goals that they aspire to within the GCF for reducing deforestation? So James Sanaya's report is great. I mean, it begins with the general rule, and this is what we're aspiring to and what we're building into our jurisdictional framework, that consent is required for extractive projects within indigenous territories. Very basic general rule, and I won't read all that to you, it will take too much time. This presentation will be available if anybody's interested in digging in a little bit more into what we do or partnering with us. But of course, with every general rule are myriad exceptions, and all the lawyers in the room will know, and the exceptions sometimes destroy the general rule. But these are the sources, these are the international sources that are out there that seem to us within the GCF to really capture what we're trying to go for. We also have the free, prior, and informed consent in RED+, the principles and approaches from 2011 by Patrick Anderson, who is really on the forefront of free and prior informed consent within the concept of RED, within the context of RED. And one of the things that his work does is it really allows us to understand that there are actually 3 levels of consent, and this is something we're building into our processes within the GCF, that there's consent to discuss the idea of a project, there's consent to participate in the project, and then there's consent to implement the project. And what he really drives is that consent is not consent if it's not acquired during every part of the process. So this is something that some of our states are already beginning to implement, particularly the state of Mato Grosso in Brazil. So on the ground, this stuff is starting to take shape within climate change, which I think is significant. The Indian Law Resources Center is also a really great resource for us that we're really working with, Leonardo Kripa in particular, where his definition, or their definition, I should say, the Indian Law Resources Center's definition of FPIC really starts to capture some of the issues that we encounter when we work with governments to impose a jurisdictional standard. So a standard that says that any projects that are taking place within jurisdiction X, if they don't meet that jurisdictional standard, then those projects are in violation of the standard. They're in violation of law. So it's a forceful mechanism. It's a mechanism that will take maybe several years before we have all the governors within the GCF on board. Because as you know, this would mean that some of the projects and the private investment in those projects within those jurisdictions goes away. But that's what we're going for. Finally, let me just quickly address this Constitutional Court decision from Indonesia. So this was really big news in the climate change, indigenous rights, nexus world in May, when the Indonesian Constitutional Court passed a decision that said the customary forests of indigenous peoples should not be classified as falling under state forest areas. This is a huge deal. This is probably one of the most groundbreaking decisions for Indonesia that has, I think, an indigenous population of about 60%. So the GCF has stepped in to really help GCF states and provinces within Indonesia. There are 6 provinces within Indonesia that are part of the GCF. That accounts for 50% of Indonesia's tropical forests. So it's a little daunting what it is we're doing because it's so significant, and we want to make sure we're doing it right. And what we're doing as one of our many, many activities through the GCF program, for example, is in a couple of weeks we will be down in Indonesia. We've gathered a group of legal experts from Indonesia, including the indigenous group that brought this lawsuit before the Indonesia Constitutional Court, a group called AMAN. And we're gathering them all to begin to train the delegates from the GCF states and provinces on how to operationalize this decision. This is a sweeping decision. It's going to take decades for this decision to actually be implemented on the ground. But we're thinking that we are positioned to actually start. So we're doing a training that has 2 aspects to it. It has the legal aspect to it. What does the decision mean? What do we do? And the second aspect to it is the immediate response, which is we are going to be training the governments and civil society partners within the 6 GCF provinces and states on how to adopt a mapping technique to allow them. So these are the people that have the most direct contact with indigenous people who show up and say, I believe that my piece of land, I have a customary right to this piece of land. So based on the Constitutional Court decision, if they do have a customary right to that piece of land, that land should not be classified as state forest areas. And this has all kinds of implications for projects, for reducing deforestation. And so we will be training about 200 people on these mapping techniques in about 2 weeks. And it's exciting work, and I think it's work that's very relevant because the decision is just so fresh and so new. Okay, so I totally cut my presentation in half because we just don't have time. But these are the organizations that fund us, that fund the GCF. The GCF Secretariat is housed here within the law school, and we are actually under the auspices of the Getchis Wilkinson Center, which is just such a fantastic thing. We have great relationships with the law students and the faculty. And the operations of the GCF really just come out of this humble law school. So we're so excited, and we're always happy to hear from you. You've all just suddenly become stakeholders in this thing. We're always excited to hear from you about how we can move this thing forward and do it right and just not muddle our way through, which is how it's like the status quo, muddle your way through. So thank you for your attention, and we'll pass it on to Roger. Thank you.
Let's give it a whirl. All right. Thanks very much. Great. Hi, my name is Roger Pulwarty. I work for NOAA. That is not short for to no avail. It's the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. Brad, thank you very much for having me, and to the people that have gone before. What I'm going to present, as Brad talked, a colleague of mine, Margaret, Hiza Redsteer, couldn't be here either. And when he said, we have good news, one of our speakers is not here, that was the good news. The bad news was I was the other speaker. So the idea here, as we'll begin to think through this, as you expect, the last speaker of the day, you expect that person to drone on interminably, so I'll try not to disappoint you. So let's think through this for a second here. I think what we're going to go through is some of the experience we've had in trying to think through some of these kinds of issues regarding climate impacts. As Brad mentioned, I sit on a couple of these IPCC things and a few other things that we work on. Margaret is working there with me as well. Margaret Hiza is actually Apsalika, lives in Flagstaff, does a lot of work on Denebikea. And the idea here that we're going to speak to is really the question of what is needed to produce the idea of being informed. And then let's talk a little bit about what changes are happening from the standpoint of impacts. As Amelia just said, there's muddling through. As a climate scientist, I model through. It's a little bit, Okay, late in the day. But the idea here, I like to say, we're giving some statement about what might be happening, a little bit of an early warning. And I always like to say that an early warning is like taking your car to the mechanic, and she says, I couldn't fix your brakes, so I fixed your horn. The idea with that is everything we write in academia and everywhere else is a warning about something or a statement about something. But it's a promise of action that doesn't always happen. And so we have to ask the question, what produces informed action and what produces consent? I always like to say consensus is when you got tired of thinking and want to go home. So let's think through this. Margaret, tomorrow we have a session at the American Indian Society for Science and Engineering where we're actually asking how do we engage people in practice? How do we engage new students, new portfolios? So we have a lot of reports out there, and you've seen and heard some of this. Several people in the room may have been involved in this. There's the Tribal and Energy Solutions Workshop. I've been working on several of these, Brad as well. But I wanted to put this up because there's a gathering set of knowledge, the evolution of an awareness that, you know what, we don't need to necessarily keep rediscovering what we ought to do. There's a great gap between policy in process and policy in practice. In other words, knowing about something is not the same as being in the process. And we'll start to think about what that means from a procedural standpoint. So these reports are out there, and we worked on several of them. But there's also more recently this report written by Margaret and Rebecca Sozi, who's here, and a few other people, just on, well, what are the unique challenges facing? This is coming out in the National Climate Assessment as part of it. But I could point to similar things we're doing with the Columbia Intertribal Fisheries Commission, with some of the transboundary issues on the Columbia River Treaty, certainly things on flooding and other kinds of issues in Montana, on Crow Reservation. And we can begin to ask, well, what are the unique challenges facing people? But let's not spend a lot of time rediscovering that. Where we are, we've done some of these reports. I sat on this special report on extremes, the Global Assessment for Disaster Risk Reduction, the UN. Margaret, myself, and others did quite a bit of work trying to get basically Indigenous perspectives into these reports. And what it led to was this other thing called Weathering Uncertainty, which was the first time that the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change actually produced a report with the input from people from around the world on sub-national levels. Now this is pretty critical, right? The IPCC loves to deal. It is designed for a nation-to-nation, country-to-country rather, process, but not very well for incorporating sub-national perspectives. And this was the very first time that we did a report that is now informing the fifth assessment. It's called Weathering Uncertainty. And within that has responses from folks in the Arctic, certainly the perspectives of people in parts of North America, some of the people that I end up working with in the Caribbean region, the Garifuna and others. I'm from a small island in the Caribbean, as some of you might know. I grew up on the western side of my island, so I have a bond with you Westerners. Anyway, so the idea here, there's that complex thing. I don't expect you to read all of it, but just to know, what we've tried to do is take cases from Australia, Bolivia, California, Fiji in the South Pacific, Kenya, the Western United States, and ask the question, who is putting things into place? What are they calling adaptation? And which decision makers are actually involved? Who is speaking for whom? And how many of these are driven by external funders and donors? And how many of the decisions are actually benefiting local practices? I wanted to read something from that standpoint that comes out from a friend of mine, Valentina Semeshkina. It says, companies working in our country act in compliance with national legislation. If those laws don't protect Indigenous people's rights, the companies will ignore them, but still look like they're not doing anything against the law. If they are bound by criteria of international donors and certifications, they attempt to reach consent with local communities, and otherwise they don't. This is quite the case for a reason why international agreements are important. Why they're not just one-offs simply because they have no teeth of compliance. Right? This is a really important thing. Throughout all of the things that we're doing with the UN DRIP and elsewhere, as people know, Preston and others talked about this, the bite is really when we ask businesses and other groups to comply with what the countries have agreed to. This is a really important thing because enforcement, as we know, is always a critical idea when we're asking people to make decisions that are different from the ones they've made before. So as we begin to think through this process, I always like to tell people, when they say, let's be proactive, I say, yeah, let's be proactive, you first. Right? Because it's easy to ask people to act up front. Right? Let's be adaptive. All right, go ahead. So from that standpoint, I'm going to just speak a little bit to some of the work Margaret, myself, a whole host, I mentioned some of Brad's work, about the Four Corners. And as I said before, we can point to some of the things we're doing around the region, certainly in the Pacific Northwest and up in the Missouri Basin. But this one in particular tells us something because we're seeing analogs like this around the world. When we talk about the climate change question, a lot of people like to talk about sea level rise, they like to talk about high elevation environments or the sea ice margins. But around the world, the semi-arid margins are where we're seeing the rapid changes. That's in the data. There's no question about it. And one of the places that we're seeing that, or where some of the people here live, which is in the Four Corners. There's some trends. That's what's happening with climate. It's going down. That's not just the stock market. The idea here is what's happening in this part of the world. People that live there are completely familiar with this. There's only some of these streams that remain in perennial flow, even after a reasonable year like we had so far. This begs the question, what is happening over the long term? Where are these changes going? And then how are people incorporating the idea of change? As I always like to tell folks, it's easy to ask folks to change, but changes that maintain people's dignity that's quite a different thing. It's easy to ask people to change, to move, to migrate, but it's quite a different thing to maintain basically a people's sense of place as changes happen. So what has been going on? Folks like Margaret and others, some people at Diné College that we support through NIDIS, but also through the RISAs and a whole host of other things. There's accounts of traditional elders, accurate accounts of changes verified in the data, and I'm going to come back to why, even though we talk about that, the whole idea of reconciling traditional ecological knowledge and so-called scientific knowledge is maybe a bit of a misplaced way of looking at things. Additional information providing insights, and the area is extremely poorly monitored. So how do we understand? And this actually is representative of a lot of other areas around the world that we've looked at. There's the case that Brad was talking about. There's the dust from northeast Arizona, changing the source, the nature, the source of where we get a lot of the water, certainly down into the Colorado and elsewhere. But what's driving this? What's driving this are changes in the sand dunes. The long-term drying out of the Southwest, together with an increase in temperature, is really what's driving a lot of the changes. We've had periods that have been dry like this before, but we have not had periods that have been as warm, together with being dry. And so what we're seeing, and this is all from Margaret's work, is basically a transition of ecosystems in the Four Corners regions. What people who live there understand, I know some people in the room do, is that it's changing even the cues that people look at in order to conduct ceremonies and other sets of activities. So where are we? There's vegetation that grew when you have adequate rainfall in 2010. The background trend is so dry that even when you had rainfall in 2010 that produced vegetation, that's what happened in 2011 when it got back dry again. In other words, the vegetation is not holding on to the ground. The land is changing. The way of knowing is changing, right? So it's not simply ways of seeing, but ways of knowing. There's the observations from 73 elders, changes in the weather, and you can see people are documenting it in their daily lives. They're documenting how these changes are affecting what they're doing, and I'll leave this up there. This is actually in the work that's in a special issue of Climatic Change that's been published earlier this year. There's environmental changes, springs and lake drying up, disappearance of beavers. Till late 1970s, there was enough water. The idea is not to map. I really think we're misplaced if we're trying to simply map TEK with observations. I really think the way we try to look at this is the original notion of objectivity. Bring all relevant information to bear on a problem. Observations, data, and people's experience over time. That gives us a full picture of changes over time. There's a little bit of an increase in temperature, 1.8 Fahrenheit, about 2% precipitation loss, and you can see that change throughout the region. And several tribes are beginning to work with us on trying to develop drought plans. But as everybody knows, a plan is as good as its first encounter. The idea of beginning the planning process is really, how do we begin to understand informed and consent in decision making? And I'm going to come back to what that means and what we've tried to uncover in all of these cases we've looked at around the world for climate change and for drought. We know the procedures. Engage participants in developing the adaptation plan, develop the contacts, convey the messages, clarify the support available, really critical, highlight the integrated policies, and identify some concrete next steps. You know, I always like to say that's a Corps of Engineers kind of thing, right? Some concrete next steps. But the idea, though, is not to help people, as Brad has heard me said many times before, not to help people do the wrong thing more precisely. There's a lot of things that are happening off-site of reservations that affect what happens on them. So what we need to do is understand the rules of the game. The rules for gathering, managing, communicating, using, and evaluating information are essential for FPIC. The question of adaptation is central. However, the idea of procedural equity is of course critical. Everybody in this room knows that, not simply distributional. And the notion of collaborative co-production is itself fraught with portent. In other words, we have to be very careful about whose voice we're engaging and who that voice represents. the nature behind conflict. They can carry appearances of advocacy. Boundaries are themselves negotiable. Many institutions, many groups feel themselves to be boundary organizations working between groups, but they act also as a boundary to knowledge. They stop the flow of information. So information use can be employed with what we call a symbolic commitment. I would like more information from you because it looks like I'm doing something. Beyond that, nothing is happening. And so we have to ask, how do we really understand how consent is derived? So to begin to wrap up, and I'm not actually wrapping up, that just gives Brad a little bit of optimism. What does this imply for free, prior, and informed consent? Well, there's one view. In the Inter-American Court of Human Rights says, the cumulative effects of existing or future activities, and the purpose of these assessments is to ensure a proposed development of an investment plan that is accepted knowingly and voluntarily. It addresses the right of Indigenous peoples to participate in the conduct of impacts assessment, the right to select and access independent experts, i.e., not for outside experts to say, wow, your traditional practices are what you ought to be using. It's what makes the people who are affected choose, and to carry out those aspects of assessments which are contingent on their own perspective. We know these things, but most of our engagement has not been meaningful in terms of implementing these ideas. And that's the case I'm making. We're learning about it. We know, and we've been trying to work with on how knowledge is developed and managed, including what stays with the groups with whom we're working, how is capacity developed, and probably the most important thing, how that interaction is sustained over time. We can no longer sort of afford what I call drive-by research, which is let's go see some people for a summer and assume that we have a long-standing adaptation plan ready for them. So what's needed now are these people, more like them. Right? It seems obvious to say, and I can add other people like Carletta Chief and a whole host of other people to this list. But honestly, we're not developing enough people at the interface that brings both of these ideas together. And as a result, it still stays as a prescriptive marketing of information from the scientific side and a perception of who the hell are you from the people being affected side. So that's where we are. There's the change detection showing the Four Corners region from 1985 to 2010. In other words, dry to dry. The green area shows the area that's getting a little wet. Stuff is happening over that area. And so what I wanted to ask you is how we get to these issues. And I wanted to put it up here, Brad, if we got the right thing here. We need to come back to this sort of question, which is, what are the rules of the game? What are the rules of engagement? We have to begin to understand that without being clear about this, what we end up having is basically a great deal of uncertainty in the interaction of the providers of information and the users of information. And in many times we as ourselves, from a research standpoint, don't ask ourselves, why are we engaging in this? And so we really have to be clear that when we're talking about things like informed consent, that the right to dissent is part of informed consent, and not the right to market information for the use. Thank you.
All right, so climate change is a huge topic, and we just managed to touch two tiny pieces on two segments, adaptation and mitigation. And we now have about 7 minutes left, and I'd love to get a comment or a question. We have some climate change experts actually out here. I don't know if Hardison's still around.
He's meeting with some law school folks.
Right?
Yeah.
Okay.
He's meeting upstairs.
Okay. You guys are all dying for the libations, I can see. Here we go.
I probably can't be heard without the microphone. My question is for the comedian.
Who was that?
You went zipping past a slide that the title which you intrigued me.
Mm-hmm.
Who cares if Alaska melts?
Yeah.
And
We're trying to end quickly.
I'm interested in knowing what that slide contains.
All right. So there's a question. Let's see if I can get it back up here, Bradley. Yeah, how do you get? Yeah, so as I like to say, we're all sort of, comics. Some of us just don't know it. The idea, the idea is not who cares, right? It's who's affected. And the reason why I put that up there was, in many cases, let me get it from, yeah, it should keep going. Yeah, I want to get you to the point here. We could produce these kinds of messages, right? From, there you go. Changing climate has major ramifications. Who cares, right? Threats to cultural and subsistence activities, threats to habitation. And instead what we're seeing right now, of course, as you know, are discussions over the law of the sea, discussions of, who owns the resources in that location, who has access to it and how it might be shared. That's who cares. Does it resonate with threats to habitation and cultural and subsistence activities? Not beyond a nodding acquaintance with these issues. It's not central to the decisions that are being made, and that's my point.
The Arctic has kind of gotten short shrift in some of the discussion on natives peoples. But if you think about it, the opportunities for shipping that we all know about, right? The Northwest Passage and transport of potentially hazardous cargoes through areas which heretofore have not allowed it. In indigenous territory, it's a daunting question how you do that. Randy Bremer.
This is kind of ancillary. How are you doing for money? You say these are what we need, these are the people you need, high-level scientists. Where is the funding?
That's really an excellent question, because what we're trying to get at is to actually take the IPCC to a different sort of stage. We're sort of written enough papers that says it's changing. 5 years later, it's really changing. 5 years after, it's really, really changing. And so what we are, however, and what I'm trying to get us away from, is the idea that we actually know how it's going to change exactly. And instead, because we don't, and instead, engage people in understanding and making transparent the risks that they're being faced. Where we do, certainly through the Drought Information System and the Climate and Societal Interactions Group that I nominally lead for NOAA, the engagement is there. However, the long-standing, sustained capabilities are beyond the capability of a science agency or any group like that. It's actually a service orientation that's needed. We've been making the case, there's been executive orders, things like that, but quite honestly, as yet, maintaining the capabilities to produce those same people I'm pointing at, we're still in a sort of one-off phase, a few experimental efforts at producing those sorts of folks who can integrate between the two worlds. So the answer is not as much as we'd like.
I think there's one more right here.
Hi, I'm Marilyn Averill. I'm sort of addicted to the climate change negotiations, probably not as much as Kim. But yeah, this panel has been great talking about mitigation, the effort to reduce the drivers of climate change, and adaptation, trying to make groups more resilient with respect to climate change. But there's a third piece that's becoming much more visible in the negotiations now, and that's loss and damage, which is seeking compensation for residual injuries that we can't prevent through mitigation and adaptation. And this question is probably more for Kim and others in the room involved at the international level. But that is, to what degree are indigenous peoples organizations getting involved in the loss and damage conversation, and how much are you trying to influence the way loss and damage is shaped at the international level?
Okay, go ahead. From the standpoint of the insurance and the reinsurance industry, we're actually trying to get a handle on this. However, our major issue right now is that it's very difficult to address without assessing what we call the adaptation deficit, which is the degree to which we're not adapted to the present. And this is becoming a major issue. How far back are we assessing loss and damage? And so certainly from a reinsurance standpoint, because I end up working with a lot of them, we're trying to get a handle on that. But for me, if we're not if, as I was just pointing out, the people who are immediately affected right now live in these areas, but we're not able to effectively address the present risk, it becomes very difficult to assess the future risk. But that being said, you know, I once thought about being a pessimist, and I thought that's not going to work. So what we're going to do is actually, basically, we're bringing the development agencies a bit more into this discussion about present risks.
So perhaps you all know how Pulwarty loses the doctor title, right?
As Brad called me his mentor, I was more of his tormentor.
All right, one more question, and we'll push it a little past 5 if anyone so desires. Burned you out.
Oh, yeah.
Kristen, do you want to end and thank our guests? And
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you all. Those were great talks, really substantive and informative. And I want to thank Brad Udall, who has been such an incredible partner to us. And I may have neglected at the beginning to say that this event was actually Brad Udall's inspiration. When I first met him as the director of our Getch's Wilkinson Center, he said he'd been talking to constituents who were trying to figure out how to deal with this concept of FPIC and natural resources and climate change and so on. And wouldn't that be a great opportunity for the Getch's Wilkinson Center and the Indian Law Program to work together? And it really has been a great opportunity. So thank you for bringing that vision and all of your hard work. And thank you to Amelia and Roger for your presentations. To all of you, thank you for sticking with us. We now have a reception, a little bit of time to restore, and then at 6 o'clock we have our wonderful keynote address by Walter Echohawk, and I know we've all been looking forward to that, and he will also be very kindly signing books after his presentation. So we'll reconvene here at 6, and our reception is just next door. Brad.
there's just one there. There's 3 people in the back of the room that I want to stand up, and you 3 know who you are.
Oh, yeah.
Because this would not have happened without Kelsey and Julie and Lauren.